binding is one of those techniques that everybody wants to learn how to do. And on the Jazz too, it's really easy. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we have our machine set to the proper settings. And that is going to be that we have a 3.5 needle position. I like to use a 2.5 to actually attach my binding, and then we're going to use the straight stitch. And I have the 1/4 inch foot that came with the machine on for this exercise. You can also use the walking foot. That's another great foot to use. A couple of other tools that I have handy is I actually have a marking pen, and this is a friction pen, and then I have a ruler, and you'll see what I do when I come to my corners that for over the years has helped me make that perfect corner, which is one of those treasured secrets that I think a lot of quilters, quilt artists share with their students, and a lot of students want to learn. I'm going to start somewhere in the middle, and I usually leave a tail, and this is probably a little longer than what you need, about 5 inches. This is actually double folded, and it is biased. You can see that that stretches. And by double folded, what I mean is that I've got 2 layers folded wrong sides together, so that when I fold my bind to the back, I have that folded edge. And the reason I use bias is easier, I think, to manipulate around corners. It's also easier to manipulate across your seam. I typically, when I stitch my bias in place, I stitch it in place by hand, and it's easier to do that. But today we're going to do it using the Jazz 2. Now I'm going to start to sew, and I am going to back stitch just a little bit, and I'm going to sew close to this corner. And before I get to that corner, I always think that the hardest thing to gauge is where to stop with my stitching, because I need to be a 1/4 inch from that corner. So I actually, using a ruler, will mark where I need to stop. So I'm going to mark where that 1/4 inch is. Now I know where to stop. At some point, it will become very natural to you of where to stop with my stitching. So I'm going to stop at this point, and I'm coming up to that marked line, and I just do 1 back stitch, not a whole lot. I'm going to take my needle out of the fabric, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to clip my thread. Now again, there are a number of techniques on attaching binding. This is one that I find that tends to be easy when you're first starting out, and once you develop that skill set, you can move on from that point. So I've stopped stitching at that point. Now I'm creating, in a sense, almost like a little ridge with my fabric. And what it's doing is it's turning a right angle so that that fold sits along that fabric edge. And then I've got the edge of my binding coming along here. And then what I will do with my marking pen, so I know where to drop my needle, is I will kind of trace that ridge that was created. And now I can see exactly where that needle needs to drop. And I want to make sure that my fabric edge is along that edge of that presser foot, the toe, and I'm going to stitch. And that one I typically don't back stitch because I'm always afraid I'm going to stitch into that right angle fold I created. And when you do that, it adds an extra stitch in there, so when your corner turns, it's not crisp and clean. And again, aligning the fabric edge of the bias with my quilt top. And as I come to this end, at some point I'm going to stop, and I mark this 1/4 inch. And I have gotten to the point now where I really don't do a lot of that because it's gotten so natural for me of gauging where that 1/4 inch is that I don't need to do that. But as you're learning, as I mentioned, I think it's something that assists you, and it's okay. I look at it as training wheels. We all had to start at some point, and then we move on or move up from that point. And I'm going to back stitch and needle out of the fabric, and I'm going to clip those threads. And again, the fold is that I always stick my finger underneath where you can, and you're just creating a right angle, taking that fold up to that fabric edge, and you can see you almost have like what I would call a little flap. Align your fabric right here, meaning the bias in that fabric edge, and then I go in and I just kind of mark, and basically what that is I can feel where that hump is, or that depth is. Align the fabric edge with the toe on the presser foot, your needle with that marking, drop that needle down, and then you're going to stitch to the other corner, and we'll repeat the same steps. And this is our last corner. I'll fold that corner. And this time, I think I've got it down that I am actually just going to feel where that ridge sits, line that up with the needle, and then I'm going to stitch. And I'm going to stop probably a good 2 inches, an inch from where I started. I'm just going to back stitch a little bit so I hold everything in place, needle out of the fabric. I'm going to clip my threads. So now my threads are clipped. I've removed my fabric from underneath that presser foot, and I'm ready to join these two pieces together so I have a continuous bias around my project. There are a number of techniques out there. This is just a really quick, easy, simple one that I probably first started using. And what I'm going to do is I've opened up my binding. I'm going to take this first binding piece up to the edge where I stopped on that second. So this was where I started, this is where I stopped. And what I'm doing is I'm folding this fabric or this bias at a right angle. Now I'm going to take my next piece, the piece that I ended with, and I'm going to place it on top of that first piece. You can see that's on top. And I'm going to come a little ways out, and I'm going to also fold this fabric so that it's at a right angle. The one thing that I oftentimes do too is I try to take this piece and put it a little bit below that edge so that when I fold my fabric over, this piece doesn't, in a sense, poke out. Now I'm going to pick my stitching back up, and I start a little bit into where I ended so that I've got a strong hold on everything. And I am going to stitch across, again using that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm catching both of those right angles as I'm stitching. And I'm going to raise that up so I can put that fold underneath there. And again, continue stitching across. And I will, at this point, I will reverse, so that's a strong and secure seam. Raise that needle out of the fabric. I'm going to clip my threads, and now you can see what I've got is what I would call these little dog ears or bias ears hanging off the edge of my fabric. I'm going to cut these off because I don't want that bulk in my binding, but before I do that, I'm just going to make sure that everything is going to fold correctly to that back side all the way around my project piece. I'm basically checking my work to make sure that everything is set before I clip anything. Now I think I'm good to go. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clip that edge there, and then I'm going to clip that edge there, and I'm just clipping up to that seam allowance. Now I'll go to the iron and I will press both sides of the seam all the way around to set. I will pull the binding to the back side and I will press, and I will make sure that my corners are popped out and nice and pressed. The next step is to actually stitch the binding in place. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to exchange out this 1/4 inch foot. I don't want to use that foot, but there are 2 optional feet that I can use, which are ideal for this type of application. There is the stitch in the ditch foot, and that has a rail or a guide that actually sits in that ridge of that seam that was created when we attached the binding. And the other is actually a binding foot. And what this does is this has kind of a ridge that you see under the underside. So it's, in a sense, it's not a level foot, but when I place that ridge up against my binding, it now becomes a level foot. And we're going to actually use this foot for this application. These are both optional presser feet that are available for the Jazz 2. So you can see that you have a lot of options open to you for all sorts of techniques, with the ability to use all sorts of different accessory feet for them. Now, as far as the machine setup, we're going to stay on that straight stitch. We are going to stay at that 3.5 position for that needle center. I am going to leave my stitch length at 2.5, and I'm folding my binding to the back side. Now, there are lots of different aids that you can use. Some people use pins. I prefer not to use pins, but there is, you can use clips. Binder clips work great. I actually use my hands for most of this because, again, I cut this in the bias, so I can really mold a lot of this around that fabric edge. And you can see how crisp and clean that looks. So again, that needle is going to fall to the left of this binding. So I can see I just need to move my needle just slightly to the left to make sure that it hits right alongside of my binding. And I think I'm aligned. I'm going to start to sew. And again, the ridge of that presser foot is ideal because it really guides up against that edge, and my needle is just falling just to the left of that binding. So when I get to the corner, again, my needle stops in that down position. And then I will pivot and turn to come the other direction. As I get a little closer, this is where I'm going to use that needle up, needle down button to ensure that I'm right in that corner. So when I pivot, that edge of that foot sits right along that ridge. And again, just continue to wrap that binding. And you, as I said earlier, you can use things such as clips. You could use pins. Again, then again, I'm not all 4 pins because I think sometimes they change the structure of what you're stitching because you're gathering fabric as you're inserting that pin. So I think any type of clip is going to be your best option. You can also, if you would like to use fusible thread in one of your positions, that's certainly an option, but I think clips would be the best. Or just simply, as I'm doing, folding the fabric and holding it as I'm stitching. And now we're coming up to the next corner, and I'm going to fold that fabric underneath so that I'm set. And again, as I get closer to that corner, I just watch everything that I'm doing just to make sure that I don't accidentally take one stitch past. So at this point, I'm going to use that needle up, needle down, needle up, needle down, so I'm sure that I'm in that corner. Rotate that fabric, lower the presser foot, and now I can come down this side. Now, as far as thread weight, I would probably go a little lighter because you can't see it as well. So anything like a 50 weight, 60 weight, or even an 80 weight would be ideal. And possibly look at trying to match your background fabric versus my binding fabric, because again, that stitching is going to be seen on your background, not on your binding. So if you accidentally, and it will happen because it happens to everybody, a stitch or two peeks out from this edge here, if it matches your background, you're not going to see it. In my sample, I used hot pink, so every time that I am not close to this ridge as I'm stitching in the ditch, you're going to see that thread color. If it were this seafoam green, it would be less visible to my eye when I'm looking at it. And again, we're coming to a corner. And I might needle up, needle down. And I'm going to rotate that corner, get everything aligned. And continue stitching. And it's okay to take your time. This is something that if you have to unsew, it's a little bit more work, a lot more involved. So it's easier just to take your time when you're stitching. So we're coming up on our last corner. And use needle up, needle down. Great way to take just a couple stitches. Now this is where I'm approaching where I started and stopped, so I've got a little bit of bulk in here. I'm going to wrap this around back side. Hold everything in place. Needle out of the fabric. We're going to raise our presser foot. We're going to clip all of those threads, and we'll look at the front side. And you can see my stitching sits in there, and again, because there's a spot right there where I went off grid, that's where having that thread color match that back would be ideal. But the best part about this is that it catches that binding along that back side here. You can see that caught that binding right there along that back side. And it's just a small little ridge. And I probably would pull that a little bit further to that back side so I had a little bit more lip there, but you don't want a huge lip on that back side of your quilt. So that's how easy it is to attach binding, stitching it to your quilt and then rolling it over and stitching it in place using the Baby Lock Jazz and certain accessories like the 1/4 inch foot and the quilt binding foot.